Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Amy Schwartz-Wallace. I'm an attorney with the Empire Justice Center, and thank you for joining us today for the program called New York's Voting Protections for Domestic Violence Survivors on September 25th, 2020. We are joined today by Corbin Street, who's the Technology Safety Specialist from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And Corbin and I will be co-presenting today on this topic of voter privacy and safety in the context of domestic violence. We're so pleased to have you with us today. And a little couple of housekeeping details. The first is today's program is a CLE. And so at a random point during today's program, I will be giving a CLE code for those that want and need CLE credit. So please be sure to, in your attorney affirmation form that is located in the handouts tab, to note the CLE code that I will be giving later. Additionally, for all of our listeners today, we have several handouts, including copies of today's presentation, as well as some additional helpful information for you to be able to use for further reading. And then finally, Corbin and I just wanted to do a quick disclaimer in that we have specific experience and expertise around domestic violence issues, but we are not voting rights law experts. So, we will do our best to field any questions that you have, and we may need to refer you on to the local Board of Elections or the New York State Board of Elections for more specific questions that you may have if we can't find them today during the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corbin, who will introduce themselves and then start the program. So Corbin, on to you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I want to welcome everybody here today. I'm so excited to be joining you all and to be working with Amy again. We met over a decade ago when I was a public policy fellow at Empire Justice Center, and got to do some great work together when I was at the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So it's really a treat to be back with Amy and with New York. I'm based out of the Bay Area in California now. And I work from my small house, which is also serving as my partner's office and my kids' school. So I say that because, if there's background noise, please do forgive that. And before we launch, just one more thing, I want to acknowledge this context that we're in today with so many people facing unprecedented circumstances with their health, their economic well-being, their physical safety, emotional safety, navigating a time like none other, where there really just are pile-ons of extraordinary crises, one after the other. Challenges that are traumatizing to those who are seated in the best of circumstances. So I say that just to help us remember that as we go into this, that the survivors out there are facing all of that and then so much more. So I'm glad you're here with us today. Grateful for all the work that you do to find ways to support survivors as they're navigating these complex and daunting times. And just a plug for you to make sure to take time to care, for yourself and for each other in that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the Safety Net project. The Safety Net is one of a number of projects at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And at Safety Net, we provide technical assistance and training on these 4 overarching topics: how technology can be misused against survivors, strategies survivors can use to safely access and use technology, how survivors can relocate. We have a special partnership with Greater Boston Legal Services around identity change and relocation. And then finally, providing training and technical assistance on federal confidentiality obligations for local victim service programs. We also do a lot of advocacy with policymakers at the national level, and within technology companies. We sit on the privacy and safety advisory boards of a number of the large technology companies, working to really lift up the experiences of survivors online and help them be able to develop tools that they can use to help make survivors' experience safer online. So today, though, we're here to talk about voting, and as Amy referenced, I'm not an expert on voting, but I've done a lot of work looking at this intersection of voting and survivor privacy specifically. I'm gonna plug in the chat a resource that we recently developed. I think it's also in the handouts section as well. This resource will be a deeper dive into what I'm talking about today. Again, I'm giving that national perspective. There's a great organization called All Voting is Local, and I'm going to put them in the chat as well, just so if you have specific questions about New York State and the voting process in New York State, I'd suggest you reach out to them. They're great. I did a presentation yesterday with them focused on Georgia and found them to be great at the state level expertise. So if you're on this webinar, you likely already know how important voting is, what an essential element of democracy it is. I don't have to get your buy-in on that one. But we hear every election season all sorts of information in the news about voting access, concerns about different disenfranchisement. But one piece of the story that isn't as prominent in those stories are the unique barriers that survivors face when it comes to voting. And not even just the act of voting itself, but also in the voter registration process. There are serious privacy concerns that can arise for survivors, and as we all know, those privacy concerns can quickly escalate into safety concerns. When information gets out into the world that a survivor wants to keep private, it can escalate into a downward spiral of harassment and stalking and sometimes life-threatening behaviors. We regularly at Safety Net receive inquiries from folks wanting to know how or why their voter registration information became public online, how to get it down. They want to be able to participate in the election process, but they are scared that their information will be made public and that it'll result in their abuser finding them. And as with most every other facet of a survivor's life, safety and privacy planning are really key elements of participating in this most basic and core element of our democracy, of casting their ballot. So today we're going to dive into this, and I'll be working to talk through some of the safety and privacy planning strategies that survivors can use as we look at this process. So first, we're going to start off with voter records and really look into how survivors can find out how their voter information is collected, used, shared, and sold so that they can make informed decisions about how their participation in the democratic process may impact their safety. So let's dig in. Depending on the state or territory that the survivor lives in, when they register to vote, their registration record may be considered public record and be available to a variety of people. All states and territories provide access to voter registration records in the form of voters list as a matter of transparency and as a tool for candidates and advocacy groups to use to send information to help inform those voters. These lists are sometimes available to the general public as well. Voter records may include a lot of very personally identifying information, name, address, party affiliation, voting history, among others. So figuring out who has access to voter records is an important part of that safety planning process. If a survivor has fled and relocated and needs to keep their address private, depending on the state or territory they live in, their location could be made available if they decide they want to register to vote. And remember, this should be something factored in not just for survivors within New York State, but for those you are working with who are looking to relocate to a new state or territory. This is one of those elements to look into in advance. So helping them research about how this works in the place that they want to go to, who has access, what protections are there? Is there an address confidentiality program? And within that resource that I sent, in each section heading, you'll see links, outside links, to get state-specific information on who has access to these lists and what protections there might be. So just another plug for that. I think it's the National Council for State Legislatures has a plethora of resources on that. So all states provide access to voter lists for political parties and candidates. Some states have prohibitions on what information can be shared in that context, such as social security numbers or dates of birth. But these limitations are going to vary, and some states don't have any restrictions at all. These voter lists may be shared with law enforcement and other government officials. Certain businesses sometimes have access to these, universities, the media, and sometimes the general public. Some states limit this and others do not. Here in New York, after the close of registration, the Board of Elections publishes a complete list of names and residence addresses of the people who have registered to vote for each election district, and they make that available for public inspection. And copies are also available to be purchased. So these are massive lists of people. The law says that information that's contained within that statewide voter registration list should not be used for non-election purposes. So there is that legal note to consider. There are also something called enhanced voter records. So this is a little different. This is separate from that what's available through the government. To get the list I was just talking about, generally you have to go through a government office, but there are commercial businesses who sell what are sometimes known as enhanced voter records. And kind of as a culture, we've become more aware of data brokers collecting and selling information about our browsing, our shopping patterns. Over the last few years, if you go to the grocery store and you fill out a discount card, when you do that, what they're doing is they're tracking what what it is you shop for, how they can better market to you. But political campaigns, over the last few decades as well, have also been compiling and sharing and buying and selling voter lists. For example, there's this company here. This is just a screenshot of one of their pages called L2. And they compile and sell information to campaigns and advocacy groups for the purposes of email solicitation, phone call and text solicitation, direct mail, online ad targeting. And these lists that they have even more information than those voter lists collected by the government. And they often reveal really highly personal information about people. It could include their religion, their political priorities, their donation habits. So a campaign might go to them and try to buy access to lists of people of specific faiths, lists of people likely to support certain topics that are considered divisive. These lists have become more and more narrowed in the era of social media. You see in this little clip of the LA Times article at the bottom just how much money is invested and how detailed they get. And this is what's known as micro-targeting, where they get personal details down to a household or even an individual, so that they can craft a message that's going to appeal directly to that person. So what are the protections that are out there? Well, some states label specific parts of the record as confidential. That information is protected from everyone who's registered. Sometimes states ensure that the full record of people working in a specific professions is kept confidential. So some states out there protect specifically, and name this in the law, victim advocates, police officers, judges. Some states protect people who work in reproductive justice. In an effort to try to ensure that their address is protected. Within New York, there is no specified confidential information, though New York does have an address confidentiality program, and participants who are enrolled in that can have their voter registration information protected and kept confidential. And again, Amy's going to jump into more detail for New York voter protections in just a bit. Of course, when privacy protections are in place, there are still data breaches that are part of our everyday reality. And these are just a couple of headlines related to recent breaches over the past few years. In one, 35 million voter records were found for sale on the dark web. In another, there was an Amazon server that was unsecured, and people gained access to the personal data of 198 million voters. And this included analytics data, like that I was just talking about with the enhanced voter records, that talked about who a person was likely to vote for and why. So even when there are things like an address confidentiality program, right, to protect them from a governmental office, something like a data breach of enhanced voter records could still leak that address out. There's still risks that happen. It's not, and that's why back on this slide I talked about how there are significant challenges to effectively controlling that data. So separate from voter lists, there are also ways to check individual registration statuses. And this is one of those questions that we get a lot from survivors who reach out and from local programs who are working with survivors. This is an important tool for many eligible voters, but can be something that could endanger some victims depending on their situation. And what the protections are in their state. These checks vary from state to state, and the information that's needed to be able to look someone up varies. The tricky part for survivors is that oftentimes their abusive partner has access to the personal information that general public wouldn't have access to. Vote.org has a state-by-state list of how to do an online registration check. I say here, scroll past the info request form. I'm just going to give you a picture. This website, unfortunately, tries to collect your information, as many websites do, but you see, it makes it look like, are you registered to vote? Give us your information. But you see at the bottom here, you'll receive occasional emails from vote.org. So this is kind of a trick to get you to give them their information. If you keep scrolling, you'll find this, which is a list of all of the states with links to click on that'll take you to the state-specific voter lookup section. This is where it takes you to for New York, and this is where some of that the state-specific info comes into play. This is going to vary from state to state, but if I were wanting to look somebody up, if I would need the county that they live in, their last name, their first name, date of birth, and zip code. Some states have more that's required, some states have less that's required, but all of these, we know that an abusive partner likely knows the first name and the last name of the person they've been victimizing. Date of birth is probably something they have easy access to. And this one I found, Georgia, the one that I did a webinar for yesterday, it was county only. It's kind of nice that New York narrows it in even more with zip code, because when it's county only, then all the abusive partner needs to do is click through each county with a first name, last name, and date of birth and try to locate the person. The zip code complicates things here. It gives another factor that they'd have to enter and guess. So the more complicated, the better in some ways for these. It makes it a little bit safer for survivors. And one of the things that we really want to focus on is talking about this. We're not at all trying to dissuade survivors from voting or from being able to access the democratic process. It's more about helping them know what risks there are and then talking through and developing a safety plan for how they can participate in a way that feels safest for them. So for survivors who aren't registered and want to be, online voter registration is available in 40 states, including New York. This could be a great way for a survivor who's gone through the safety planning process and figured out a plan that works well for them to be able to register, especially during the pandemic. However, another element to remind them of is the device safety piece, right? So if they're going to be submitting their personally identifying information to register, and when I looked it up in New York, I think it goes through the Department of Motor Vehicles website, and they're asking for your driver's license number, your social security number. So there's personally identifying information there, your address. So if they're concerned that the device they're using is being monitored, if technology abuse is at play in their life, they may want to use a different device that they aren't concerned that the abusive person may have access to. A friend's device, when there's not a pandemic, when libraries are open, access from a library computer or at a victim advocacy program. Automatic voter registration is another way that people can quickly register. AVR happens when they interact with certain government offices, like the Department of Motor Vehicles. With AVR, when you go to the DMV to get your state ID or license, you can also be automatically registered. I think Amy and I were talking about this a little bit before the webinar happened. It was a bill in New York was passed over the summer by both houses, but has not yet been signed by the governor. But it is something to look out for. Oh, so this is just a link to show you. There's vote.gov is another resource for checking in on how you can register in different states. It's similar to the vote.org, but on that you can go and it will take you to the online registration page for New York for those who are interested in that. And it's nice because it also shows the registration deadlines for people who are interested in voting. Some of the concerns, though, that come up, and this is specifically related to AVR, which again may be pending in New York, is that it's always really important to pay attention to the forms that you fill out and what you're consenting to. Hopefully, the state has made the opt-in or opt-out process very obvious. Because again, a person is going to receive an ID. They're going to get their driver's license. Sometimes they have these connected to Department of Social Services, so they may be applying for benefits. So we want to make sure that the forms are there if automatic voter registration is a part of that process, that it's very obvious, that a survivor doesn't mistakenly overlook it when completing the process to get a driver's license or to get their benefits, and hopefully they've crafted it in such a way that it's easy to understand what any privacy concerns may arise related to that registration. This is why it's important to advocate on a policy level for those kind of protections so that people can really make informed decisions and not get caught off guard by a privacy breach. A lot of the questions that we get at Safety Net is I didn't know when I registered to vote that my information was going to be made public online. And we want to work to craft processes where that's not the case, where people get information up front about what's going to happen and who may have access to it so that they can make informed decisions. Now we'll talk a bit about voting and survivor safety. And I will say too, even in the states, we've talked with survivors who, as a strategy to keep their information as minimally online as possible, they registered at the latest date that they could, and then they voted, and then after they voted, they canceled their voter registration. So that was a way to create a more, a briefer window where that information would be available online. There's all sorts of strategies that survivors can come up with to still be able to participate even in those states that aren't very protective. So again, just want to point that out, that even if they are concerned, there might be other ways to navigate around it that really minimize that for those who do want to participate. So with the voting process itself, it's important that survivors know the options that are available to them in their states. These are kind of the four primary options that are available through absentee ballot, a voting by mail process, which is separate from the absentee process. Many states and territories now are opening polls early, especially in response to COVID-19, trying to minimize large groups and long lines. And then, of course, voting on election day. The voting by mail and the absentee process could be a really helpful way for survivors to be able to cast their vote without concern of running into the abuser at the polling place. So this is especially probably helpful for those who have separated from their abuser. There are, though, for survivors who are still with the abusive partner, who reside in the same space, or if the abusive person has access to their living space, there are risks that are at play to consider. So wanting to make sure that kind of those are looked at and planned around. An abusive partner could try to get access to the mail ballot or the absentee ballot and throw it away. They could try to interfere with the person's ability to cast their ballot. We've also, heard about abusers trying to monitor who a person is voting for. So again, some of these concerns arise when voting by mail. So if someone is still with their abusive partner, it might be that early voting or going to the polls is a better strategy. But for many, it could provide more privacy, and it can be very helpful for those who are working, who have kids at home, that they're trying to juggle all of that, and especially right now with those concerned about their health, this can be a great way for them to vote safely. All states have an absentee process. Some of these require a reason, others can be requested without demonstrating a specific need. And then with the voting by mail process, a few states now offer this by request. California is one of those where I'm at. This year, because of the pandemic, they're mailing a ballot to every eligible voter automatically. But that's specific to COVID-19 pandemic only. And then with voting by mail, ballots are returned, by mail or at the polling place or a designated drop box. And then, of course, voting at the polls. Some states and territories offer early in-person voting, and this can be really helpful because it expands the number of days that a survivor could go to the polls. It makes it easier for them to plan around when their abusive partner might show up there. And they can work to time the trip where it overlaps with the time the abuser will be busy. Another thing that we've heard about is similar to what I was talking about with votes being monitored by mail. Also, if a person is still with their abusive partner and they both go to the polls together, the abusive partner monitoring who the person's voting for, looking over their shoulder, making sure they're voting for who the partner wants them to vote for. So we wrote up here just to remember that poll workers are there, and part of their duty is to help preserve a person's right to cast a secret ballot. So they could potentially be someone that a survivor could connect with to try to help support them in their desire to cast a secret ballot. And with that, Amy, I'm gonna pass it over to you unless any questions have come up that I can help answer right now.
So this wasn't, Corbin, thank you. That was really excellent presentation, by the way. It's not so much a question as much as it's a comment, which is from Remla, who runs Empire Justice Center's Crime Victims Legal Network, and that is a statewide program for crime victims and their advocates around the state. And they now have a safety and voting section on the New York Crime legal help section. And I'm sure that this program today will be even further informing that particular section. And so that is another great resource. And in the questions tab, you'll see a direct link that Remla very kindly put up there. So I would just ask all folks who are participating in the webinar today to put any questions that you have in the questions tab, and we will get those answered at various points throughout the program. Okay, so just going to start my presentation. Hopefully everybody can see my presentation. Corbin and Michelle, can you see my presentation? Okay, terrific, yep. Thanks. All right, so before we get started, I'm going to give the CLE code. So all of you that need CLE credit, please note the code at this time. The CLE code is 925YK. Again, that's 925YK. All right, thank you. All right. Oh, hold on one sec. All right, so a little bit about New York's election laws. It is building on some of the things that Corbin mentioned. We actually have two really excellent election law provisions here in New York State that are actually fairly dated, but they have been updated in recent years. And I suspect that some of the reasons that these were updated was because of the fact that I think that they weren't particularly well utilized. And I'll be talking about both of them today, and I'm really hoping that today's program will really get the word out more specifically about access to these laws, because they really do address some of the issues around safety and privacy that Corbin was talking about a little bit earlier, and I think that they can really provide some excellent options. So Corbin broke everything down into two categories. The first was around privacy, and the second was around access, which shouldn't necessarily be totally conflated, because they are two separate things, although survivors might need both. So they should be considering, as advocates, you should be considering as all of these as part of a safety plan. But the first is election law section 5-508. And as I mentioned, this was a law that was passed in 2010. And I remember when it was passed, and essentially everybody said, this is a really great law, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to really access the courts to get the people the relief that they need. And this law provides for confidentiality of voter registration records. So if somebody has access to this particular relief, their name will not appear on the public voter registration rolls. And as Corbin mentioned, all sorts of mischief can be had by access to, voter registration information, and, from abusers and others. So this can be an incredible tool as part of a comprehensive safety plan when you are talking to your clients. So I mentioned that this was originally passed in 2010, and in informal surveys that I conducted around the state, I didn't know a single advocate that had actually used the law. And I think that the courts were, not really quite sure what to do, and advocates weren't sure what to do. And so the law was amended in 2017 to really make it much more user-friendly, and including the requirement that forms be created by Office of Court Administration that now allow people to actually file and have a template. It also expanded what courts somebody has access to get this relief, including courts that don't have any kind of filing fee. So it allows victims of domestic violence to go to court to obtain a court order specifically from a judge. So this is a judicial requirement. It includes from civil courts in the county where they're registered, and it requires, this court order essentially requires the local board of elections to keep somebody's voter registration records separate and to keep them private. and to keep them away from any other voter registration records. So when all of those things become published later, the names of the people that have registered and have this relief are not going to be available. And the only people at that point that can view any of those records are actual election officials, and even then only within the scope of their duties. So it's a really important tool to be aware of. Hold on one second. Okay, so the law defines, as I mentioned, it talks about victims of domestic violence, and in many New York State domestic violence laws, you'll note that the term victim of domestic violence is not just a term of art, it's actually a statutory term. And here in this case, New York defines, in this section of the law, victim of domestic violence the following way. And it talks about people who are victims of violent felonies, as well as a variety of enumerated family offenses. And it also requires that the act or acts of intimate partner violence have resulted in actual physical or emotional injury or created a risk thereof, which is a fairly similar definition as is included in the New York State Social Services Law, which also defines victim of domestic violence, and has actually been updated more recently. But in fact, this is one of the pieces of the definition that's contained within there. So why they didn't just simply reference the social services law, which is broader, but they chose to define it as with including violent felonies. And the acts have to have been committed by a family or household member. And I underline that as well, because that is also a more than just a term of art. It's actually statutorily defined term. So those of you that have been doing domestic violence work in New York for a while will recognize this definition of family and household member, because this is the definition that's contained in the Family Court Act and the criminal procedure law that defines victim, family and household members as people who are related by blood or marriage, who are legally married to one another or formally married, who have a child in common, or who are in an intimate relationship. And so it's really, this is really quite a broad law because it doesn't just limit people to the enumerated family offenses, and it doesn't limit the relationship between the parties in order to access this relief. Okay, so in order to get this relief, the process really is, and what I, if possible, before somebody registers to vote, it would be really helpful that they petition the court prior to the registration so that they don't have to worry about backtracking any of that information. Corbin had mentioned one of the safety, planning things somebody did was to register to vote at the very last minute and then to cancel their registration immediately afterwards. If somebody were to obtain voter registration privacy first through a petition and then register at the same time, then they wouldn't necessarily have to worry about backtracking on any of their information getting out. When somebody relocates within the state or relocates to New York from somewhere else and they're newly registering, this would be a good time to, before they file an updated voter registration form, to consider using this relief at that time. If somebody's already registered in their home county, they would just simply go in and file for this relief and frankly hope that the information that they have, doesn't get out there. But, I think ideally, if you have any updates to be made around name or address, it would be a good time to file for this relief prior to having your voter registration records out there, because really they are so public. After somebody is granted one of these orders, they have to actually serve it on the local board of elections. So it's not just, it is a much more formal process where you actually have to have it served. And and then you are able to register to vote at that point, and your records will be confidential. What I would encourage people to do, if they're already registered to vote, that they bring this to the when they are serving it, bring it to the Board of Elections, and ensure, by speaking at least with a human who's actually in the Board of Elections, that your personal information will now be kept separate and confidential. This is a relatively new process by going to family court, and so it's really important to or go to family supreme or county court in order to do this. I'm not sure how many of these the courts have actually granted at this point, so I always think it's important for people to bring a copy of the law with them as a way to show to the Board of Elections or to people over in the courts that you have access to this type of relief. And I have included in the materials not only the template for the petition, but also the template for the final order that the court can grant relief for. And I see a question. Somebody said, do you have to have an open Supreme or family court case in order to petition for this to get this relief? And I'm not aware that you need to have an open case. You have the ability, as long as you jurisdictionally can, meet the requirements, you have your choice of forums. You can go to family court, you can go to Supreme Court, and you can go to county court. So there is no requirement in the statute limiting this relief just to people who have open cases. So that's a great question. I would just tell folks that the family courts are able to grant this relief, and it's definitely important to note that in family court there is no filing fee, whereas in Supreme Court there is a filing fee. So it's really, maybe much more user-friendly and quick to access this kind of relief in the family court. And so I see another question. Any word on whether the family or Supreme Courts are hearing these types of petitions given the limitations right now? That's also a great question. I would say that given that this implicates voting rights and voter access, that if this is not elevated up to the courts hearing it quickly, please let Empire Justice Center know. We would be happy to work with you to reach out to the administrative judge, because it does impact constitutionally protected rights. And so if the courts are overburdened and not sure if this is an essential matter, even though I know that they're hearing things beyond essential matters at this point, I would encourage you. The statute doesn't say anything about filing this as an order to show cause and needing this to be an order to show cause. So I would say try to file it, and then if you can't get in relatively quickly, to reach out to the administrative judge or Empire Justice Center, and we can try to assist you in that process. So in this next slide, I have a link to the form as both the court order as well as the petition. And again, I mentioned that it's in the materials, and you can take a look at your leisure, but it is a form that is, or the petition must be sworn, must be notarized. The other thing that is important to note is that you can request confidentiality of this as a pending action. So it doesn't necessarily state how you do that. So it's important to, if you do need to file an order to show cause in order to access this courts relatively quickly, you should note right in the order to show cause the request that this be kept confidential, and try to speak with the clerks about how to file one of these things without the client's name being made available in the online court system scheduling system, so that other people couldn't necessarily access this. And it's also important to note, Corbin had mentioned the New York State Address Confidentiality Program. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the program, New York State Address Confidentiality Program allows for people who are enrolled and participating in this program to have their address be kept confidential, both for mailing purposes as well as for service of process. So on the petition itself, it asks, are you enrolled in New York's Address Confidentiality Program? It asks, were you granted address confidentiality in any other kind of family or Supreme Court case? Because that is another kind of relief that people can access. It asks if you are residing in a domestic violence shelter. And then it asks the other basic jurisdictional questions, whether are you a victim of domestic violence perpetrated by a family or household member. So the way that it really is written, if you are enrolled in any of those programs, whether it's an address confidentiality program, in a shelter, or have previously been granted address confidentiality by one of the courts, you may be able to get this relief relatively easily and relatively quickly, kind of like, and this is essentially what the address confidentiality provisions are already in the Family Court Act and in the Supreme Court, in order to get address confidentiality for your court proceedings. The court order form mentions again that it has to be served, and that the court order is intended to be valid across the state. So if you get an order, for example, here in Monroe County for address confidentiality, that if you then take that order and you relocate, say, to Erie County over to Buffalo, the Buffalo Board of Elections should be honoring the order from the Monroe County Court, and that specifically states that earlier. The order shall apply to any current and future addresses as well, so it's important to keep a copy of the order, because if you re-register to vote somewhere else in New York, you'll want to ensure that all future addresses, especially if you're in a different county, that you can give them a copy of this court order, and again, they should be honoring that. So every time you move, you should not need to get a new voter registration confidentiality order, which is really important. And if you request this relief, it is appealable. All right, and I just see a couple of questions in the questions tab. So one is, somebody made a comment a few weeks ago. I asked a judge about filing these and how they would be handled in New York City family courts, and was directed to try Supreme. Interesting. Well, you do have the absolute right to file in family court, and the statute says that. Even if the courts don't necessarily know how to do it, they should figure it out. And you should be talking to the administrative judge who's either handling the family courts or that administrative district to talk about how people are going to, how the family courts are going to be handling it. Somebody says, FYI, information on the address confidentiality program are also on the crime victims website. So thank you. And then the other person said, this was in light of COVID and essential matters, just wanted to let us know. So again, it's according to this, it's really important that the courts should be honoring this. Again, the ability to vote is constitutionally protected, so I would be making the arguments that this implicates voter access, and they should be hearing these cases. Okay. All right. I know I'm moving through this relatively quickly. So updating your change of name or gender marker or address in a prior registration. So survivors flee, they relocate, they change their name as part of safety plans. Sometimes survivors from the trans or gender non-conforming community may have changed their name, not as much related to domestic violence, but to have their name conform with their gender identity and expression. So it's really important that if you are doing an update to your name for any one of these things, that again, you want to ensure that you're protecting that new name or that new address as much as possible. I also put a link in here about voting rights for trans folks, and so anybody that wants to, that's a whole separate training, but I wanted to make sure that if you have particular interest in this topic, that you at least have access to some resources. So people who do a name change, often right after they do a name change, will go and begin to update some of their vital records, as well as their things like their Department of Motor Vehicle licenses, or their non-driver identification cards. And because New York has motor voter, and allows you, when you're updating any of those records, to simultaneously update your voter registration, it's important that if somebody has already updated everything with their new name, that they may have already updated their address with the voter registration. And so you can, as Corbin showed, you can check the status at the voter lookup site on the New York State Elections website. And we don't have a specific form just for updates of changes of name or address. The update that you use is the same basic voter registration form. So there isn't a specific form just for updates. It is like all one form. So it's important to note that, when you're registering to vote, that's the same form that you're going to be using than you would if you were moving counties. Okay. And Corbin mentioned earlier about New York's address confidentiality program, and the address confidentiality program doesn't, while it provides address confidentiality and does require that different agencies honor and respect the provisions, there aren't specific language in either the law or in the regulations guiding the address confidentiality program on voter registration protection. So yes, people are entitled to this ongoing protection for voter registration if they're enrolled in the program, but it doesn't say how they're supposed to do it. So when I looked at the Q&A on the address confidentiality program, this is what they said, which is participants should contact the New York State Board of Elections directly for assistance in voting without disclosing their address. And so that's what the address confidentiality program tells folks to do. And then they gave the address, phone number, and website address. So I would encourage people who are already enrolled in the address confidentiality program to reach out to the New York State Board of Elections for further guidance on this. For survivors who are living in temporary housing or shelter or homeless, we mentioned the special ballots. I'll be mentioning the special ballots shortly. That is a tool that people can use, but it's important to note that people who don't have a permanent address are still able to register to vote. And people who are homeless or living in temporary housing can list a shelter address as their voting address. If they, one of the examples that they gave somewhere is if somebody's like living in a train station and that's their home, as long as they have a mailing address, they can register to vote, and the mailing address doesn't necessarily have to be their residential address if they don't have one. So it's critical, if somebody wants to still vote and they're worried because they don't have a permanent address, that they absolutely can still continue to vote. Okay. So I mentioned this before, this contains some dates, and it's also critical that not only can you get a voter registration form in English, but they're available in Spanish as well as accessible versions. So I included a link to the New York State Elections website. And that way, any voters can have access to the kinds of voter registration forms that they need. Okay, I've included the deadlines for registration as well. And again, you can review these at your leisure. And with the remaining time that we have, I want to talk about casting votes. And New York State in 2019 updated the special ballot law. And the special ballot law allows domestic violence survivors to request or to return something called a special ballot. And it can be, you can cast your ballot in person or by mail. It's somewhat akin to an absentee ballot, but you can go to the Board of Elections. You should reach out to them directly and ask how you would do it in person, but you can get access to a special ballot, and that would allow you to cast your special ballot either in your polling place I'm sorry, without having to go to a polling place. You can mail it in, or you can vote in person, in advance of the election day. You also have the ability to mail it in. And those are to be used when a victim has left their home, but you don't have to have left your home in order to use a special ballot. The law essentially states that anybody can use this. If you look at the statute, if you can demonstrate that you have the threat of physical or emotional harm to yourself or to a family member, and then you therefore wish to cast a special ballot. So again, it can be a really important tool for somebody who's already registered, but maybe has left their home due to domestic violence and are not necessarily in their home at that moment, or for somebody who is living in the home but doesn't feel safe going to their polling place on election day or casting their ballot through another absentee process. They can use the special ballot process. Okay. And as I mentioned with the other law, this is not very common. And in fact, there is very little, even on, if you peruse some of the local voter boards of elections in some of the different counties, you're not going to see a lot about special ballots for domestic violence survivors. So it's really important that if you or one of your clients wants access to this, you want to make sure to have a copy of the law so you can go through it with whoever is there, because they may not be very familiar with this protection. This statute also uses the term victim of domestic violence. However, unlike the prior law that I mentioned, victim of domestic violence is not actually a defined term. So it's really broad, and because it doesn't reference any specific subsection of the law, you can just assert in writing that you are a victim of domestic violence, and that should be sufficient. There is no proof requirement, that you don't have to walk in with orders of protection or medical records or any other proof that you're a victim of domestic violence. Merely a signed written statement swearing or affirming that you are should be sufficient. You have to swear or affirm that you've left your residence due to domestic violence. And third, that because of the threat of physical or emotional harm or to family or household members, that you want to cast a special ballot. Okay. And then it gives specific requirements in there about the how the local boards can have you cast that ballot. Okay. All right. And also there's some deadlines here that I wanted to make people aware of, as well as some additional resources. So I'm going to now open the questions tab and see if there's any additional questions that have come in. Okay, there's quite a few comments and questions. Okay, so the next one is, somebody says Albany County has a special ballot application process available online. That's fantastic. Applause to Albany County. All right, and the next person asks, if someone moves out of New York State, is the protection program transferable to a state that also has an address confidentiality program? Or would somebody have to begin the process all over again? So I think that this question relates to address confidentiality programs, and those are actually state by state. So if somebody moves out of state, I believe that they would need to, it's because it's not national, and it's not a court order or anything, it's just an administrative program. So it, access to, just because you have access to an address confidentiality program in one state doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be entitled to an address confidentiality program in another state, because there's not a court order necessarily that's attached to it. And And each state really has the control over how they're going to handle their own programs administratively. So I would say that if somebody is moving out of state and they want to enter a new address confidentiality program, they should probably apply there. And Corbin, you might have more information about that than I would, but
No, I think that's exactly right. It's going to be state by state, and the qualifications are going to vary across the board, the
yeah.
protections that are offered. So definitely important to look into and research in advance.
Yeah, and then the questioner then asked, have there been any instances where address confidentiality programs have been susceptible to data breaches? I've not heard of anything like that. Corbin, have you heard that like different?
I have not.
Yeah,
I've not heard about any breaches that have happened. It doesn't mean that they won't happen. I think we're kind of at a point in time, especially with everything being as kind of technology based as it is, that at some point, it's a matter of time. It's not if, it's when. But to date, we haven't heard of any. And if there have been potential ones, hopefully they've been able to be kind of quelled and mitigated pretty quickly.
yeah, great. So I see we're just about at time. I would ask if anybody has any additional questions to please use the question feature and we'll do our best to answer them. And I would just remind our listeners today that all of the handouts that we either referenced today or you saw as part of today's program, our PowerPoints are all available in the handouts tab. They will be available. If you're having any trouble trying to download them, please let us know here at Empire Justice Center and we can assist you or send them to you. And with that, I would just say thank you to everyone who joined us for today's program on this lovely Saturday or Friday, heading into a long weekend for many of you for the Jewish holidays. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice weekend, and thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Amy, for inviting us in.
Thank you. Thanks, Corbin. All right. Take care, all.